Thank you very much. Dear distinguished invited speakers, Professor Yanis Varoufakis and Professor Donatella della Porta, but also dear distinguished visitors of this special evening. All of us were also excited about this event, and when we looked to the booking of this conference, we saw that the booking of this event was faster than even the conference participation. So all people are hunting to this special evening, what we have today. What we are doing, also I saw, possibly not everyone already could arrive from the queue, but here we have further guests here. I think all people who could make it or came here, also the speaker of last night, Professor David Harvey is here, Silja Wolby, Margaret Abraham, the president of the ISA. She told me I should tell you, submit your abstract for the ISA until 30th of September. Previous ESA president Pekka Sulkunen is here, and of course Apostolos, the local host. So everyone is here, everyone likes to get here. We start the session. Yesterday evening we discussed the capitalism at work. Capitalism seems to be, in my point of view, in good standing. There's strong supporters in Europe. Then, in our sub-theme, we have fragmented solidarities. And third, we have subjectivities formed, on the one hand, of not only what we enjoy so much, Occupy movement and resistance and Podemos, but also the supporters of the neoliberal order. Well-formed subjectivities. And I think it's threatening to also have these formed subjectivities of the depressed, the marginalized, the precarious, under precarious working conditions. And I think, in my personal point of view, even for us academics, many of us are urged and pushed to be self-entrepreneurs in this academic ranking system, focused not on the peers in a scholarly community with aims to improve society, but aims of improving their own position in the academic system. So all this is quite fragmented solidarities, threatening subjectivities, is quite depressing. And we discussed this afternoon or at lunchtime with Professor Klaus Offe, Europe entrapped. This evening should show the way out, so that at 10 o'clock we can go home with a good feeling and the problem solved. And for solving all these threatening problems now, we invited these two distinguished speakers as kind of doctors for curing the patient. And on the one hand, I'm really glad, and I think it's very important for us that we also invite people from non-sociological disciplines. When I think about the Queen's questions, the Queen of England, she asked the question in late 2009, I think it was, economists, why didn't you foresee this crisis? Yeah, no one foresaw it. And I'm so glad that she didn't ask us. Yeah? And I think the only one who has an eye, who looks to this situation, who has a sensitivity for the social, there are not so many economists out there, in my point of view. I'm reading a lot of economics also, but one of them is the doctor of economics, yeah, Yanis Varoufakis. So he's here we need this expertise from the other discipline. And on the other hand, all of us know that when we talk about social movements, we think about Donatella. And when we talk about Donatella, we think about social movements. So she's the expert to look to where the grassroots are growing out there. Yeah? So we think we start in this way. We start with him, the analysis, and then she looks in an empirical way, what is going out there, how is it developing. Yanis Varoufakis, everyone knows, but I should shortly repeat. He studied in the UK, he taught in the UK, he taught in the US, and he got honorary professorships, and he's holding them in Turin, in Sydney, and in Sussex. But he is a professor here in Athens. So it's also good to have a professor from the host city here with us. He has many books. The most recent one is Adults in the Room, My Struggle Against Europe's Deep Establishment. And 1 year old is the other book. And the Weak Suffer, What They Must, Europe, Austerity, and the Threat to Global Stability. Of course, all of us know that he has been finance minister of Greece in early 2015. So I give the word to Yanis.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, for the invitation. Thanks to the European Sociological Association for coming to Greece, to the eye of Europe's storm. It's a little bit like a field trip for you, isn't it? Sociologists, especially in the surrounding areas where you can see both the social class divisions by just visiting Paleofariro next to us or the adjacent area. But the main reason why I'm happy to see you all is because you still exist. I remember when I was an undergraduate, in the beginning of that Thatcherite era in the United Kingdom, I remember that one of the many campaigns as a student activist that I joined, amongst the C&D demonstrations, the defense of the steelworkers' rights, picketing for them, the anti-apartheid movement, the Troops Out movement, there was also a movement in my own university, which was Essex University, which was called Save Our Sociology Department. Because apparently Mrs. Thatcher wanted to close down the University of Essex, and if she failed doing that, she certainly wanted to close down the sociology department. Sociology was a bit like, you know, the Cato expression or call for Carthage. Carthage must be destroyed. That was the Thatcherite view of sociology. It had to be destroyed. The question is, why? Why was there so much venom towards sociology? My hypothesis, working hypothesis for tonight, is that this had a great deal to do with a great transformation of capitalism, especially Western capitalism, capitalism in Europe, and in particular in the United States of America. That was going on at the time. There was an ideological need that was part and parcel of this great transformation to bleach out of our main meta-narrative regarding the world we lived in, bleach out of it anything that could not be explained as a sequence of pure exchanges between autonomous, self-motivated, fully sovereign individuals that were defined a priori and before society could be mentioned. Thatcher's famous response to a journalist from Women's Only, I believe, that there is no such thing as society, was not a throwaway line. It was part of a political campaign which reflected the great transformation that I believe was behind the attacks on sociology. Now, before I delve further into this macro picture, let's look at our micro experiences as academics. Well, I was an academic until recently, so I think I retain the right to refer to you as my colleagues. Those of you who are old enough, in particular, will remember how in the 1980s we experienced a steady encroachment of quantification, the measurement culture. Anything that could not be measured had no value. Judgment was reduced to computation within our universities. Deciding whether one should be promoted or not became a matter of some indices. Values had to be completely and utterly diminished to the state of prices from an economics perspective. But also, everything had to be moving in this direction of cheapening. Whereas academics used to be judged on the basis of the great books that they authored. Suddenly, writing books, at least in Britain, in the 1980s and 1990s to this day, was considered to be a sign that you were not sufficiently focused in your research. You had to write articles, because articles gave you the points, the brownie points that you needed, especially in economics. I remember once I applied for a job in one of the London colleges, and I was told that my CV looked splendid, except that there were too many books. Could I remove them? So from books to articles, and then from articles to writing research proposals, and from writing research proposals to writing and rewriting copies of one's CV. This was more or less the climate. It was, speaking again from a political economy perspective, it was like the wave of neoliberalism and quantification that we were experiencing, trying to take Adam Smith and expunge the theory of moral sentiments, making sure that the only book we knew was The Wealth of Nations, and not even that, because this had dangerous ideas in it, only the idea of the invisible hand, which fitted so perfectly to the 1970s and 1980s neoliberal turn, which was the ideological cover of the great transformation that I'm referring to. Now, let me now talk a little bit about the great transformation. What particularly am I referring to? This is not a Polanyi-esque story. It is more the story of the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971. After the Second World War, the phase of capitalism globally that we lived in, and which was the birthplace and birth time of the European Union, since our topic today is the making and unmaking of Europe. That period of the 20 years of the golden age of capitalism, the 50s and the 60s, was predicated on an amazing experiment. Come to think of it, it was just, if anybody had imagined of proposing this in 1935, in 1938, they would have been thought of as just rabid utopians. So how did it work? Very, very briefly. Very briefly, it was a system of fixed exchange rates, a bit like the euro, but without one currency, which was stabilized, small parenthesis here, when you have a large monetary union, like we did under the gold exchange standard, like we did under Bretton Woods, like we now do with the euro. And you do not have a system, a mechanism, a political mechanism for managing the recycling of surpluses and deficits, you end up with instability. You get with irrational exuberance, which leads to a major crisis, and then the whole burden of adjustment falls on the weakest of shoulders, the Greeces of the world, or of that union, and then the result is a very steady descent into an abyss, which can lead either to the disintegration of that union or to even worse outcomes like those that we experienced in Europe in the 1940s. To stabilize the fixed exchange rate regime that the United States effectively created at the Bretton Woods Conference, the New Dealers that were running the show in Washington, D.C., introduced a political mechanism which they commanded and which they managed, by which to take a large part, about 70% roughly, of American surpluses and recycling them in Europe, and to a lesser extent in Japan. The result was the period that we had after the Second World War, with the lowest inflation, unemployment, highest growth, and massively shrinking inequality. It was the environment in which the European Union grew. The European Union was part of this global plan under Bretton Woods. The point of Brussels was to create a cartel of heavy industry that would stabilize politically Central Europe, while at the same time ensuring the recycling of surpluses within the European continent, while the United States were doing that business at a global level. The tragedy, of course, was that that system could not survive the end of America's surpluses, because you cannot recycle surpluses that you don't have. That was the reason why the Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971. Now, the thing that actually all free marketeers will never acknowledge is the fact that the miracle of the market can only work if it is managed at a macro level. Whenever capitalism has been left unmanaged at the macro level, it has sputtered, it has defaulted, it has fragmented, and it has produced massive wars. Now, interestingly, after 1971, the end of Bretton Woods, if you look at the institutional setting globally, you will not find anything resembling the Bretton Woods system. It's been a free-for-all, more or less, with the exception of the World Trade Organization, but nothing compared to the kind of strict hierarchical management that we had in the 50s and 60s. So how did it all manage to, well, capitalism, that's what I mean by all, stabilize itself? It was a very dynamically unstable equilibrium, which is a contradiction in terms, but nevertheless, it was a remarkable equilibrium, the one that we had after, let's say, 1980, with the rise of neoliberalism providing the ideological cover. Allow me to just explain it very, very briefly by saying that the explanation lies in a remarkable memo that a man called Paul Volcker sent to another man called Henry Kissinger. Remember him? That was when Kissinger was in the National Security Council, before he became foreign minister, Secretary of State. And Paul Volcker was one of the young Turks working for the administration, providing, as a former banker, advice. And the question that Henry Kissinger asked Paul Volcker was, and other aides, but Paul's response was the interesting one. How can we ensure the continuation of the United States hegemony now that we are becoming a deficit nation? This is a typical Henry Kissinger question. Yeah? And the answer that Paul Volcker gave was just so prescient and outrageously interesting. He said, well, if we cannot recycle our own surpluses, we might as well remain hegemonic by recycling other people's surpluses. Now, this is exactly what has been happening in the global capitalist economy since the mid-1970s, late 70s, early 80s onwards. The twin deficits of the United States, the trade deficit and the budget deficit, have been operating like a huge vacuum cleaner, sucking into American territory the net exports of Germany, Holland, Japan, later China, of the surplus countries. The question, of course, is, well, why can't we do this in Greece? Why can't a poor country do this, live off the net exports of others? Somebody has to pay for these net exports. Well, the way that this was paid and the recycling loop completed was by ensuring, by means that I don't have the time to enter into now, ensuring that Wall Street became the magnet that attracted, while the United States economy, the shopping malls were attracting the net export of Germany, Japan, and China, Wall Street was attracting their profits. So the profits made in Japan, in China, by selling net exports to the United States were recycled through Wall Street, and therefore the loop closed. About $5 billion net a day, $5 billion net a day, was flowing between 1980 and 2008 in 2010 prices through Wall Street. Now, what do bankers do if you give them $5 billion of spare cash to play with every day? They find ways of turbocharging it. Financialization. Financialization was essential for the new US hegemony and the new post-war phase after 1971, after the mid-70s. And financialization demanded the complete eradication of all checks and balances, all regulation over the financiers, over Wall Street, the City of London, and Frankfurt, and a little bit of Paris. Neoliberalism was the ideological cover for this. And the changes in our universities, and finally coming to the beginning of my talk, the assault on sociology were part and parcel of the same historic, epic dynamic. Have you noticed that after 2008, neoliberalism is being discussed? Before that, it was not being discussed. It was a little bit like racism. No racist would ever discuss racism. Similarly, no neoliberal would ever discuss himself or herself as a neoliberal. But now we have this discussion. There are some chinks in that armor. Well, the reason, of course, is that 2008 was a massive rupture in this model of global capitalism. Even though the United States deficits, both the trade and the budget deficit, returned very quickly within 18 months to where they were in 2006, 2007, Those deficits no longer have the capacity to provide Germany, China, Japan, Korea, and the other surplus net exporters with the requisite aggregate demand necessary to stabilize them. The result is that we have a deflationary era that began in 2009-2010, that Donald Trump tried through his loquaciousness to address, but has failed. A deflationary period which, like every deflationary period in the history of capitalism, begets political monsters. The political monsters in Germany were not the result of hyperinflation. They were the result of the deflation of Mr. Brüning. The deflation that hit the United States, actually the whole economy, with 3/4 of debt trading with negative interest rates. You only have to state that. The price of money is the interest rate. When it becomes negative, you know capitalism is going through a spasm. It means that the money markets have failed. It means that we have the greatest incongruity in the history of capitalism, worse than the 1930s. As we speak, I shall refer to Germany because it is a successful economy. Germany has the highest level of savings in its history since 1945 and the lowest level of investment as a percentage of GDP. You only have to state that to realize that things, even when they're supposedly good, are really undermined by macroeconomic imbalances underneath that are absolutely detrimental to any sense of stability. The reason why the Schwabian housewife in Germany that Mrs. Merkel referred to, approvingly suggesting that Wall Street bankers should get a lesson from her, the reason why the Schwabian housewife is courting with the idea of voting for the Alternative für Deutschland, or the reason why she is despondent with the establishment, is because of negative interest rates. And the negative interest rates are nothing other, in my considered opinion, than a mere monetary reflection on the inability of global capitalism to recover from the 2008 rupture. The inability to find a replacement for the global surplus recycling mechanism, which was destroyed in 2008. Europe, in this context, is the most brittle and problematic of the economic blocs around the world. Now, the reason is very simple. The European Union was constructed as a cartel of big business in the 1950s. Cartels are pretty good at dividing amongst its members gains. They are atrocious at dividing losses. Look at OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. When the price of oil is going up, it works well. When the price goes down, they fall to pieces. They fight one another. Coordination is completely and utterly lost. Remember the first name of the European Union? It was the European Communities for Coal and Steel. It was equivalent of OPEC in the heart of Europe. It was part of a global plan. There was a political and a humanist project attached to it for ending war once and for all. But economically speaking, and sociologically speaking, in reaction to the cartelization of Central Europe, that cartel could not sustain the global shocks that began with the end of Bretton Woods and especially culminating in the 2008. To put it very bluntly, what was the first thing that the Europeans did when the European leaders, the European elites, the European establishment, what did they do the moment they realized that Bretton Woods was dying and that global system, financial system that the United States created and managed was no longer going to be providing them with the fixed exchange rates, which they absolutely needed. Because when you create a cartel in the heart of Europe, you need the same prices. You don't want fluctuations in exchange rates within Europe when you have a cartel trying to sell the same thing at the same price and to agree amongst themselves as to what the prices will be, including the common agricultural policy. You really need fixed exchange rates. So the first thing they did was to create the snake, which was an attempt to reduce fluctuations in exchange rates. The second thing was Giscard d'Estaing and Helmut Schmidt, 1978, they got together in Aachen, and then afterwards, after they signed the agreement, they visited the Charlemagne tomb to get inspiration from the great leader of the Christian Empire. They created the European exchange rate system, the European monetary system. And then later on, the exchange rate mechanism, which crashed and burned in 1992, yielding the euro. So we tried to create or recreate in the heart of Europe the gold exchange standard, thinking we were creating a Bretton Woods system. What is the difference? The difference is that the gold exchange standard did not have a mechanism for recycling surpluses politically, and the Bretton Woods system did. So in our attempt in Europe to create Bretton Woods, we ended up with the gold standard. It's called the euro. It's actually worse than the gold standard because we cannot simply do what Britain did in 1931 or what Roosevelt did in 1933, simply to declare that, okay, we're leaving. Because we have only one currency, and getting out of it, it will take about a years of a disaster of trying to recreate a new currency nationally in order to devalue it. This is why I was never in favor of Brexit. Europe's gross immaturity can be gleaned at the fact that we are, or our elites are, absolutely incapable of or unwilling to understand the minimum prerequisites necessary for the perpetuation of the European Union and the Eurozone. When I was in the Eurogroup, I'm now going to speak to you as, not as a left-wing minister, I'm going to speak to you as a university person, as an academic. We academics are used to putting forward hypotheses, proposals, theories, in seminars, in conferences, and having a host of our colleagues trying to shoot us down. This is how we work. What we're not used to is what I experienced in the Eurogroup. The Eurogroup would take my analysis of what was the matter with Greece and a series of proposals. And then I would look at blank stares in people's faces who were practicing what I call the Swedish national anthem routine. Whether I had proposed what I had proposed with my diagrams, analysis, debt sustainability projections, or sung the Swedish national anthem, their reaction was exactly the same. As an academic, you have no idea how soul-destroying that is. Tell me I'm an idiot. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me that my fingers don't stand to reason. But don't stare at me and then open your mouth and say what you would have said had I sung the Swedish national anthem. Now, that doesn't happen in the United States. It doesn't happen in Japan. It does not happen in China. When the United States have a major crisis, do you know what these people do? Whatever criticism we have for the Americans, they get around the table, you know, the chairman of the Fed, the president, the secretary of state, the secretary of the treasury, the good people from Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, all you know, the real masters of the universe. They sit around a table and they ask themselves one simple question. How can we stop this crisis that is destroying us and depleting our power? What do Europeans talk about when they get around the table? I can tell you. How can we pretend that the rules that we created some years ago, which are impossible to enforce, are being enforced? Let me submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the answer you get to the second question has nothing to do with the answer that you get to the first question. This is why Europe is such a joke. You know, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Americans are looking at our great and good leaders, and they are not laughing because it's tragic. The European Union is a massive enterprise whose success is essential for the success of the global social economy. So it's not funny, but it is a bit like watching King Lear and wondering how can these supposedly smart people or characters be acting in such a deluded way. But this is not a problem with European DNA. It's the fact that we have created a cartel that is incapable, like all cartels, of dealing with crisis. It was like a fantastic riverboat, very beautiful riverboat, that was launched on a calm Atlantic Ocean. And then, of course, at the first sign of a storm, it started leaking water. It was not designed for this purpose. And what is the worst is that we now have a situation where the deep establishment of Europe around that cartel, which has been enhanced massively by the inclusion into it of the banking sector, the most ridiculously inane banking sector in the world. You know, when in 2008 all the banks around us were collapsing, remember, we Europeans, at least our leaders, used to feel rather confident that our banks were not like those idiotic American banks. They were far, far worse. Lehman Brothers had a leverage ratio of 22-1. Deutsche Bank had 70-1. BNP Paribas was 65-1. And then we entered the period of gross denial, from gross immaturity to gross denial, in which we still find ourselves. The notion that President Macron's election has ended the disintegration, has ended the rise of that hideous nationalist international across Europe, is perhaps the most dangerous notion in Europe today. Allow me to complete this sojourn of mine in a combination of economic history and some intellectual history by saying that at the moment, as a result of this process of denial and authoritarian incompetence, the Swedish national anthem routine, we now are facing a very interesting challenge as progressives, as intellectuals, as Europeanists, as Europeans, as Greeks, Italians, Germans. And it is this. In front of us, on our television screens, in our parliaments, in the public domain, there seems to be an almighty clash between the deep establishment and what I mentioned as the nationalist international. But I'm very much afraid that these are not real antagonists. That this deep establishment that still imposes austerity to this little country and is still in denial about the unsustainability of the Republic of Italy and the Republic of France within this Eurozone, by remaining so obstinate, they are feeding the beast of the Nationalist International. And the Nationalist International seriously need the deep establishment, because otherwise, without the authoritarian incompetence of the deep establishment, they wouldn't exist. Nigel Farage would not have existed without David Cameron. Ms. Le Pen would not have existed without Mr. Hollande and the various Mr. Hollandes before Mr. Hollande. So what is our challenge? Allow me to say that our challenge is a new progressive international across Europe, which is challenging this interplay, this four antagonism between two accomplices. This is why, after I quit Parliament to concentrate on politics, as I like to say, all I've been doing, instead of going back to university properly, full-time, is concentrating on what we call the Democracy in Europe movement, which is a band of radical utopians who feel that we have a duty, the duty that our predecessors, our grandfathers and grandmothers had in 1930, and which they failed to carry out. What was the duty of Democrats, independent of whether they were liberals, social democrats, Marxists, in 1930? My view is that their duty in 1930, particularly that year, just after the deflation hit and before the abyss was reached, their duty was to reach out across pre-existing, more or less irrelevant party lines, not ideological lines, but party lines, and across national borders, to create a pan-European democratic movement that prevents the slide into the abyss. This is what we're trying to do. People say it's utopian. My response, our response, is that the only alternative to a radical utopia is a really awful dystopia. I'm very happy sociology is still around, but don't be happy about the fact that your role, especially the younger members of your profession, is going to probably be to chart a postmodern 1930s. I would want to encourage you that while academic endeavors are absolutely splendid, they are insufficient. You've got to join the Progressive International because in the end, it is not sufficient to study society, we have to defend it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. He told me before, please make them ask the most critical questions. And therefore we will do it this way, that after his speech, she will immediately speak. And after that, we give full power and full time for your questions. There are 1,200, 1,300 people. We have 1 hour. Prepare your most critical questions to ask them later. We will collect many for both of them and have this after her talk. He talked about the masters of universe and called for a new progressive international. And the question to Donatella is, does this new progressive international, could you already find it out there? She's a professor of political science, as most of you will know. She was very long at the European University Institute in Florence and now moved to a school also in Florence, Scuola Normale Superiore. And her most recent book is Late Neoliberalism and Its Discontents. And 1 year ago she published Where Did the Revolution Go? So where did it go, Donatella?
Well, I'll tell you. I'm very grateful for this invitation. I'm very honored to be here. I don't promise that I can do what our president asked me to do, to give you an answer about what to do to solve the problems. But what I want to try to do is to see in the perspective of social movement studies how an international of critical Europeanist could develop. And I want to do this on the basis of some assumptions which I developed after researching the different moments in which movements addressed Europe in the perspective of Europeanizing the type of actions. And what I want to state in this brief introduction to the debate that I'm looking forward to is seeing Europeanizations for social movements as not a linear trend, but in a way a trend which is not stoppable, and also a trend which implies different type of paths and different type of characteristics in different moments. And I want to look at 3 such moments, starting from Athens in 2006. When I was here at the European Social Forum, the 4th editions of the European Social Forums, which I think represented an important moment, a peak in the hopes to develop a critical type of Europe, critical visions of Europe. But at the same time, I want to see what happened before that, because I think that it is important in order to see to which extent we can move again towards Europeanizations of social movements, and on the other hand, to see the challenges that the European crisis brought about to these visions. What I want to show is that even if in a selective way, even if with a lot of interruptions, I think that social movements of the progressive type have not given up the chance, the opportunities, the struggle for another Europe. But they may have introduced during the crisis some corrective mechanisms to the way in which Europeanizations had been addressed during the time of the European Social Forums. And I want to stress that European Union institutions and other transnational institutions have worked as a sort of coral reef in producing what nation state had produced for the labor movement. That is, the need to address a certain type of polity, a legitimation to a certain extent of this polity, but also the development of organizational structures, of identities, which go beyond the national level. So the European Social Forum, 11 years ago in Athens, was the 4th edition, I think already had most of the elements of the framing for the constructions of another Europe. Activists here in Athens said, we reject this neoliberal Europe. We are fighting for another Europe, a feminist, ecological, open Europe, a Europe of peace, social justice, sustainable life, food sovereignty and solidarity, respecting minorities' rights and the self-determinations of peoples. This was the typical, what sociologists call motivational frames. What is the Europe we want to construct? And always in Athens, about 11 years ago, activists also decided the identity of a critical Europeanist. They said, we, women and men from social movements across Europe, came to Athens after years of common experiences, fighting against wars, neoliberalism, imperialism, colonialism, racism, discriminations, and so on. And I think that this is still something that is very widespread in social movements of the progressive side. They had also defined, as social movements usually do in their framing, let's see if I can get it all, the enemy. Or they had defined what was the European Union that they didn't want. And they presented themselves as somehow successful in this struggle to block the neoliberal tendencies, to develop social struggles towards a Europe from below, a social Europe, against Europe as a fortress, and so on. And they listed some victories. And there was an optimism, even in singling out the type of negative sides of the European Union. There was an optimism that struggles from below could change the European Union in a positive direction. What we saw later on was that these hopes seems to have been, how can I say, excessive or too optimistic, because after 2006, with 2007 and 2008, the type of European Union that was in front of these activists and of us was a Europe which had become more and more neoliberal, less and less open to pressures from below. And I think the crisis brought about made this trend quite visible. How can this type of movements addressing European Union transnationalizations of movements be explained from the perspective of sociology and political science? In international relations, there are research which says that there is a politicization of international organizations in general, that there is a growing power of international organizations, that there are growing demands addressed to these organizations, that there is a declining capacity of these organizations to answer these demands, and there is a declining legitimacy of these institutions. That the assumptions that these institutions could be legitimized from the output through a sort of benignant capacity of improving the public good, failed, and failed dramatically in front of the crisis. This is an analysis from people who are experts on the side of the international organizations, and I think the European Union epitomized this type of developments. It was one of the institutions in which these trends are more visible. But what social movement studies can do, given the politizations trend, is to try to understand under which conditions politizations of international organizations can bring about the development of progressive alternatives of an international, of critical Europeanist. Scholars of international relations had singled out challenges of international organizations on the input and on the output side. Electorally unaccountable institutions. European Union is an institution which was supposed to increase its electoral accountability from one treaty to the others, but the reality we saw during the crisis was that decisions went away from accountable, more or less, institutions into the least accountable ones. International organizations are organizations in which democratic and non-democratic regimes are present, and what we see in the European Union is that more and more there are regimes in which illiberal democracies tend to develop. Transnational governance has challenges on the input side because it is non-transparent. And what we saw in the financial crisis during the most dramatic moment was the keeping hidden the lack of transparency to the most strongest ways. There is a difficulties to build a public spheres. There is a weakness in the constructions of public norms. And this also has an effect on the output side. What we saw in terms of developments of international organizations is a transformations in the financial institutions with increasing power, is a change in their missions, as we see with the World Bank and with the IMF, is a change in terms of increase of their implementation capacity. Is a weakness and a weakening of those institutions which were considered to be more benignant, and it is instead an increasing crisis, I call the responsibility crisis, of those institutions which were considered to be a model for transnationalizations. So this is the situations in which I think in which we can read the European Union context. How do social movement studies contribute to, say, give some optimism, give some hope in these situations? What research has been observing is that in these situations we have seen a growing on transnational protest events. And it is important because transnational protest events are not the majority of the protest events, but as I'm going to say, they are important because they have created symbolic and material resources for transnational organizations to develop. They have developed frames. So when I showed the first slide with the European Social Forum, the idea of constructing another Europe, it developed slowly during encounters between activists that initially were focusing on different specific issues. And these activists had some hope in the beginning. Some of the leaders of the European Social Forums were leaders of NGOs that had tried a more insider strategies, but were disillusioned and developed more critical type of visions. And at the same time, though, what they developed was also demands for more global type of politics. And I think there are here already two moments that's in the development of process of Europeanizations and transnationalizations of movements that we can reflect upon if we want to assess to which extent there is space now for the development of an alternative form of Europeanization. Studies on the European Union and the potential for movements developed in the beginning before the development of the European social forums, imagining that transnational social movement organizations could exploit some informal channel of access to the international institutions, including the European Union, through adaptation to the required style of politics, required type of organizational structures, certifications as good participants in the European polity. And that through lobbying in Brussels, things could change. I think the second moment I told about, the European social forums, developed from the disillusionment that this path could bring about a transformations at the level of the European Union, but also more broadly at the level of other international organizations, starting with the United Nations. The second moment with the development of European social forums and counter-summits, which also played an important role, was a moment of, I would say, full displayed type of Europeanizations of movements. There were acknowledgement of the multiple opportunities and challenges, so that someone talked also for social movements of a sort of venues shopping, capacity of articulate struggles at the different level, trying also to exploit the different opportunities that different European Union institutions could offer. There was the capacity to develop networks, because the European social forums were made of hundreds and thousands of organizations, which were not all transnational organizations. There was a development of European identities. It was a process which we saw emerging and developing during the Counter Summit, during the European social forums, which were moments of development of cognitive ideas about what Europe from below should be about. And there were multiform, various types of campaigns with protests in the streets that I think played a very important role in putting the idea of another Europe in front of the European citizens. I think there were three main mechanisms working here. A relational mechanism, so as it had happened for movements of the past, including the labor movements, it was by constructing actions like protests at the European Union level that nets were prepared. The events may have been short, 1 day for counter summits, 3-4 days for European social forums, but people prepare it for years, for months, from one edition to the next. And this created relationship of trust and networking. There were cognitive type of mechanisms and changes, because these events became arenas for exchange of knowledge. So here in Athens in 2006, there were hundreds of workshops where social movements from the local level of different cities and different countries met and built up ideas. And there were affective ties, which were important. So these moments were moments in which people were empowered, enjoyed being there. There were different type of paths that this movement took. In some cases, and for some of these movements, the European Union was seen as potentially more open than the domestic level. I come from countries in which, in Italy, especially Berlusconi time, we thought everything is better than the national government. And this was true in particular for some movements, for the environmental movements, looking for some type of legislations that could be implemented, especially at national level in countries in which governments were less easy to influence on this topic. But there was also, I think, true transnationalizations. So a European polity was constructed, which was not just the European Union. It was a sort of critical social capital which developed during these transnational events, in which supranational and national politics were targets at the same time of movements that moved at very different type of levels. And this was, say, 2006. What happened with the crisis? With the crisis, it happens that this image that Europeanization was unstoppable or was growing in a linear way among social movements in Europe was challenged, let's say, because what we saw is impositions of policy choices by unaccountable institutions, what Yanis was talking about. In the past, there have been a lot of debate about social movements' capacity to affect the European Parliament, the European Council, the European Commissions, but ECOFIN is not something that you can easily find a way to affect. European Central Bank was the most unaccountable of all of them. Also, what became more clear for movements was the degree to which neoliberalism was embedded in European Union institutions. So the fact that it was not a temporary trend, but that institutions needed to be dramatically changed, European Central Bank first of all, but also the others, if you wanted to develop ideas about another Europe. The crisis also introduced constraints on democracy because memorandums of agreements, memorandum of understandings that were imposed to several of the European Union nations imposed the signatures by the governments and the parties in the oppositions, effectively eliminating the democratic dialectic of government and oppositions. There were anti-labor pressures, so the idea that the European Union was consensual and deliberative in its development were challenged dramatically by the impositions of policies without, social policies without any consultations with unions and other partners. So, responsibility crisis at the level of the EU, increasing budget control and all this. Brought about, for sure, declining trust. And don't want to go in the detail of these figures, their trust in European institutions. They failed dramatically following the crisis in all the European institutions, in the European Parliament, in the European Central Bank, in the European Commission. No? Okay. Ah, good to know. And what I want to show in these pictures is that the drop was all the more dramatic when we see the figures in the countries that were most hit by the crisis. the countries that we studied in this research. So, trust. So what happened then? Which type of development we saw in the ways in which European social movements tended to address the crisis? I think what we saw to a large extent was going back to path of domestication. That is, trying to still address the European Union, but doing it putting pressures, especially on national policies, which emerged as, to a certain extent, more easily to influence through electoral process, electoral accountability, protest demonstrations, which we saw very often going on. So the European and politics and European Union are still very important. They are fundamental because there is a recognition of that level as having strong responsibilities in the crisis of stripping off rights, including democratic capacities of the people to control elected governments. But at the same time, there is also attempt during the crisis of movements to affect their own governments, first of all. And this is also a consequence of the ways in which the crisis developed. Different timing from Iceland to Italy, different type of characteristic of the crisis in terms of balances of public debt and private debt. All this made that these movements tended to be, again, seen and developing more at the domestic level. And now I promise I try to go to the last slide. What do we saw here? Last 5 minutes. What we see here is challenges and opportunities for movements. On the one hand, often if we follow the type of toolkit of social movement studies, we have challenges in increasingly neoliberal European Union institutions. The hope that you could influence the European Union institutions through insiders type of strategies finished, but also the optimism that was embedded in the European social forums to a certain extent tend to be strongly challenged. On the other hand, though, I think that there is a perception of a need to scale up the type of fight. So what Yanis presented as his initiatives is an important example of the perceptions that I think is spreading among social movements that this time started to develop more at the domestic level, that you cannot address solidarity with refugees or issues of precarity without targeting the European Union level, without addressing a polity which is important. Side of the challenges in terms of mobilizations of resources. I'd mentioned that during the crisis, the European Union institutions had done all what they could to decertify, to misrecognize unions, to weaken trade unions. They are doing now the same with NGOs and other organizations that are active on the progressive side. And this is something which goes together with the fragmentations that political economists have often pointed at of the social basis during the crisis. So this is a serious challenge in the perspective of building an international for another Europe. At the same time, though, what we see looking at social movements is that there has been a layering of social movement organizations, so that from all the different steps which I mentioned, there are still groups that are there, and there are other groups that are developing. And that to a certain extent, this diversity is enriching, because it brings about for instance, different practices of struggles, different experiences of struggles, different degree of commitment. And this is going to change, I think, the panorama, the type of resources available. There is, I think, an enrichment which we see active, especially faced to the threat, faced to the risks. Framing. These movements have been, recent ones, have been sometimes characterized as nationalist, even on the progressive side, even on the left. And for sure there has been a return of a discourse on national sovereignty. There has been a return of national flags, also in the progressive squares. But I think that this type of challenges of closing down the attentions to the world and focusing only on the national level is overcome by the type of deep-rooted cosmopolitanism that this movement have developed on the progressive side. So their capacity to bridge concerns with sovereignty with attention to global type of issues. And I think from the point of view of these actions, there is for sure a challenge to the capacity of the groups to coordinate. There is a challenge to the trade unions. There is a challenge to NGOs and to social movement organizations of the most different types. But we also saw, and we talked about this morning during the conference, discussing utopias, discussing Klaus Offer's book. I think there is also the capacity of these movements to develop at the same time different types of alternatives. They are in the streets, and we saw still a lot of movements in the streets. Each time someone proclaimed that the movement are dead, there is a new Nuit debout or anti-G8 protest. We saw movements in the squares, which also meant a movement that wanted also to prefigurate, to experiment with the alternatives. And we saw, and also with your presentations, movement in the institutions. So these movements were extremely critical of political parties of the existing type, but they were also extremely open to use channels of access to the institutions. New movements parties emerged, referendums from below emerged. So there is, I think, also from the social movement side, a perception that faced to the crisis, you have to try to occupy all the possible space. So is this something which is going to give us the positive answer we can go to bed happy with, that these movements are going to produce an alternative? Well, I tend to be optimistic, but I also see a lot of the challenges. I see to a certain extent a moment which the neo-institutionalists called a critical junctures, which means is a moment in which you have strong struggles. It's the Gramscian crisis, in which the old is dead but the new is not born yet. And it is a moment in which you can have Trump winning, but you can also have alternative winnings. You have a moment of strong mobilizations. And if I want to be really optimistic, we are near to the 50th anniversary of 1968 in 2011. And reflecting on this, I can say, I had hope, or I had some ideas, some observations that make this time, to a certain extent, similar to that one. It's a time in which there is a perception of a crisis. There is a perception of the need to produce alternatives. It's a time in which radicalism is again considered by the activists as a positive term. So there is the idea that you have to dare to produce new alternatives. And it is a time in which ideologies and utopias are again emerging in the practices of the movements and in the attention of the activists. And final observations, since this is a conference in which there are a lot of young people, I think that what emerged recently is the fact that generations which had been considered as disillusioned because of the crisis, as unable to act because of its precarity, depressed because of the situations in which they grew up after so many years of crisis, what we see is that this generation is emerging as particularly open to progressive ideas and particularly interesting in putting these ideas in practices. So I think that there is still a lot of work to do for social movement scholars and for Europeans in general, but I think that the context is a context in which conflicts are still open-ended, and we can do a lot in order to understand them, but also maybe to steer them in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are excellent in time. Now we are well prepared for the next hour. When I looked to your figures, I saw the revolution growing. At least there was a green line. And you also said you see it growing here in this hall with our 1,200 people. Our topic now is, as you know, of the conference and of this evening is making Europe. Are we in the process of making Europe, or are we in the process of unmaking Europe? I was thinking very hard, listening to both, to find these most critical questions towards the lectures which he asked for. And I have to say I didn't find it, so I need your help. But let me start with one question to both, which is interconnected, just to show also my respect to both and to ask a question that I like to ask since very long. And then I only ask it, then I collect more questions, and then we give the floor to both of them. My question is the following. You mentioned the Swabian housewife, and I completely agree to your criticism of the Swabian housewife's attitude, Chancellor Merkel, although my own mother is a Swabian housewife, but you will understand how I mean this argument. Swabian housewife is saying save, no debt, saving, yeah? When I, let's say 20 years ago, I was trained in a way, I grew up in a world, it was written in the newspapers, the German economy in Germany is a powerhouse in Europe now, but it was a sick man of Europe, the sick man. And now it's the export champion in the world and in Europe. And I'm always thinking that isn't this, I think when you resigned from your previous job in 2015, I think you also had this argument. You said it was about loan and resisting the Swabian housewife attitude in Greece in a way. And what the Germans did in the early 2000s was they were wage dumping in my point of view. So there's an agreed inflation target rate in Europe of about 2%, and the Germans are extremely under that. Yeah? And Italy and Greece were above this. I mean, it must be like that. If one is lower, the other one must be above. If not, you cannot meet the middle way, the actual empirical inflation rate. So I think, isn't the problem this wage dumping? And it's so extreme that from the Greek position, you can never solve this problem here. So this is my question to you, not very critical. I think very close to that, what you wrote, but this is one question. So, but this leads me to the second question. Wage dumping, isn't this a subject matter of a movement, of a very old movement, of the workers' movement, labor? Yeah, it's wage, it's employment, labor market. It's one thing. And to Donatella, therefore, in the 80s, when I studied, I learned, all of us studied Habermas, and the picture was there's a system out there, capitalism, and here we are, life world. And the life world resists, and then we have new social movements in the life world, ecological movement, gender movement, feminism, resistance to the system. And I know from my own students today, yeah, they enjoy very much every movement everywhere, against racism, Gezi Park in Istanbul, Podemos, all new movements. This is our land map. But I'm asking myself, possibly the land map of all that is currently changing. I mean, I'm waiting for your answer later on. If this with wages, if this is the argument, if this is behind, yeah, not so much talk about do I like Europe or not, but more, it's a wage problem in a way, yeah. And it goes back to the not so much to the new social movements, but this old social movements, yeah. And at lunchtime in the lecture, Teresa Pulano made the argument: isn't social class the new unit that we should do research on? Yeah, possibly. My question is: this social movement, is this? I mean, new social movements. Is there a move to the old social movements? This is the direction of my question. But these are just two questions, a bit connected. Now I open the floor to your questions. I will collect a few, and then let them fish some of them, and hopefully we can answer all. But who likes to join me asking a question? And I'm, of course, waiting for the most critical. Here's one in the mid. You could also say to whom you address, but it could also be kept open.
Good evening, and thank you for your presentations. I'd like to ask Professor Varoufakis about one thing, and I'd like to address both the economist and the former Minister of Finance of Greece. In June 2015, so you have been close as it has never been before to a renewed European economic politics. And you had afterwards to resign from your position, and it has been lived. I'm French, and for the equivalent, let's say, between brackets, equivalent party of then Syriza in France, it has been lived as, okay, now it's not possible to do it, look at what happened to the Greek. And so the argument of the political movement, of this same political movement, have been to say, yes, but look, Greece is only 2% of Europe's GDP, and France is 19%. So my question is, what if a political movement like Podemos in Spain, or La France Insoumise in France, or any other likely politic left progressive movement take the power in one country in Europe, does this argument of the weight in terms of GDP is valid to actually self-reform European institutions? Thank you.
There's a question. Oh, there are many questions.
If Europe is a game theory, is a prisoner dilemma against the nature, if its movement is a collective goods, is a common goods or not?
Can you repeat that?
Europe is a prisoner dilemma against the nature or not? And for Professor della Porta, social movement, what is the solution to also dilemma that transnational nature of movement, social movements to get in a Europe question?
Okay, it's difficult for me to see, but now I take the following order. Here's a question, and there's a question waiting very long, and it's a and there. 1, 2, 3.
I'm from the UK, very unhappy about Brexit, interested in your perceptions of how within this environment, rooted cosmopolitanism, as Donatella has mentioned, and progressive internationalism could be furthered, if you like, if there is a continuing disconnection from EU movements. But I think it's also actually a question for other countries as well, because there is a danger for that democratic deficit to lead to further Brexit-type situation.
Okay, now over there.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. My question is to Professor Varoufakis regarding the development of European progressive left. My question is, do you see it as an elite project? So in other words, we cannot deny that there are rising cleavages in the European low-wage segment along the line of national origin or ethnic origin, if you will. And it doesn't look like in the near future there will be a European-wide unification of precarious low-wage workers, but rather rising nationalist attitudes and tensions. So do you think that for the establishment of a European progressive left, it is important to mobilize this particular group? And if so, how can sociologists contribute to that in concrete terms?
Thank you. And the next one is there. And then we give them the chance to answer.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation and the chance to ask questions. I want to ask both of you a utopian question. What would happen if we opened the European border and let everybody in who wants to, and make sure that they come in?
Okay, thank you. Now we have the first round. We listen to their answers, and then you can prepare for the second round. Who likes to start? Donatella.
Well, I start with the question about Habermas and new and old social movements. Research on social movements has tended to focus on the new social movements, but there has been more and more recognition that the old movements had never died. And if you look at protests of different types, social movements on class issues, on issues of social inequalities and so on, are more and more present. So we have done research based on protest event analysis. In Italy, large majority of the events are on issues challenging inequalities, asking for more equality and so on. The point is, as it happened also in Latin America, for instance, it is no longer a recognition of one conflict that is more important than the others. If you see also the type of activists that entered institutions in countries like Portugal, where there is a very interesting experiment on the left, you see that these activists carry with them identities which belong to the old movement and to the new movement as well. So they are young women very often, they are precarious workers, they are environmentalists. So what I think it happens already with the European Social Forum is a bridging of issues of social inequalities and new social movement type of concerns, which had never been developed really apart from each other. So there had been a dialogue between those. What I think is very different from the situations that Habermas described, for instance, in his analysis of legitimacy crisis, is that those type of crises were related with what was considered to be the typical interventions of the welfare state, the dominance of the public over the private, and so on, while neoliberalism represents the opposite type of development. And I think that in this type of evolutions, two types of movements are emerging. Polanyi type of movements, which are defending what Polanyi calls counter-movements, defending the old rights, which have been stripped off by neoliberalism and austerity policies. But you also have what Wallerstein and world system analyst called anti-systemic movements. So that there is a new radicalism that is is stronger than in the European Social Forum, the perception that you have to discuss the roots of the problems in capitalism type of development. Address another questions, the Olson dilemma. The Olson dilemma applies to very different level of politics. So what we know is that most collective identities are imagined in a positive sense. They are constructed, and Olson said that the problems was in fact related with having free riders committed to a public good that they could enjoy even without struggling. But I think social movements have, even at the local and national level, shown that Olson was, Olson paradox was the fact that nevertheless people tend to be committed. Now with Brexit and issues of which type of developments we are facing, I think that there is also a moment of big challenges, so that when we see results on the Brexit issues, we see that we have the countries split in two. It was the case in France, it was the case in the United States. You have strong conflicts. And I think what we saw in Southern Europe to a large extent is that very often right-wing populism tend to develop, especially when there are no alternative on the left. So what we saw is that also in the United Kingdom, there is now a development of alternative on the left, which is challenging also those choices, even if it is too late. And so I think that it is a moment in which also Brexit options, also the extreme forms of racism and xenophobia, which are growing in several countries, including mine, are a concrete risk. But I think that this makes the building of an alternative all the more needed.
Thank you.
Let me begin with our chair's question about the Swabian housewife. There's nothing wrong with the Swabian housewife's attempt to economize. The problem happens when everybody's economizing. In Germany and in Holland, you have a situation which is untenable. Greece was untenable, but so was that surplus part of Europe. You had, for the very first time in the history of capitalism, I believe, a sustained period of 8 years during which families saved, corporations saved, and now we have government saving. Well, you can't all save. We can't all be savers because somebody has to borrow. It's really simple arithmetic. So you can't simultaneously celebrate your surpluses while admonishing other people's deficits. There is an incongruity there. Just the arithmetic doesn't add up unless you devise means of having intergalactic trade and capital transfers. So the problem, of course, is not one which is specific to Europe. This is a problem with capitalism. Capitalism goes through spasms of realization crisis, of periods during which the falling rate of profit gives rise to incongruities that cannot be surpassed without a massive sacrifice of maybe sometimes a whole generation. But Europe is a particular example, or actually an acute case of a capitalism that is very specific to Europe, to the European Union. The cartelization, initially in the 1950s of heavy industry, followed by the agricultural sector, followed later on with financialization, with the Frankfurt, City of London and Paris banks, gave rise to, call it a beast, a system which made it impossible for the Swabian housewife to do that which comes natural to her, especially in an aging Germany, which needs to save for tomorrow, while at the same time contributing through her savings to a balanced equilibrium at the macro level. So the point I was making before was that, well, this is something that the New Dealers understood. And they understood it because of the Great Depression. This is something that here in Europe we never understood, really. And this is why the state of macroeconomics is in such, is so powerless, and has been in the great centers of the academy in the European Union. Now, allow me to now change a little bit, move away from this. Our defeat in 2015 in Greece was tragic for the people of Greece and for some of us personally, but nevertheless, we should find ways of looking at it and using it as an investment in the future. The good news is that that event, despite the distortions, the ways in which we were demonized, and the ways in which we started falling out against one another, the typical left-wing sectarianism. But nevertheless, I believe that today Europeans understand how the Eurozone and the European Union works a lot better than they did before 2015. They understand how our governance models have failed, why they have failed. They understand that the Eurogroup, which makes all the decisions, and the European Commission has become non-existent, is not even a legal body, that everything is decided in the corridors even before this non-legal body convenes. And more than that, traveling around Europe, I find that the spirit that we had here for a short few months, what we call the Greek Spring, has managed to penetrate the spirit and the thoughts of people who didn't necessarily agree with me or with what we did here in Greece. So when I'm in Germany, when I'm in Hamburg, I was in Hamburg recently, when I'm in Berlin, when we are everywhere from even London and, you know, Brexit land, let me say, to all the way to Spain, one senses a determination to go beyond things like the World Social Forum or the European Social Forum, to go beyond just conferences where we get together and chat, to do that which we're trying to do with PM, which is to come up with ideas and proposals that could be implemented tomorrow morning. Therefore, they are not at all radical, but at the same time, which are designed as the foundation on which to build a radical future. And let's face it, a radical future, this sounds like a paradox, but I don't believe it is essential, is a prerequisite for the survival of Europe, for not going through a kind of slide into the postmodern militant parochialism that we see rising up everywhere in Europe. Remember, we started the Eurozone crisis with the North-South divide, and now we have an East-West divide as well to add to it. Let me just finish off with 2 points, one on Britain. I found myself in a very strange situation where I was campaigning around Britain, around the country, against Brexit. And the good folk who used to come and listen to me would say to me, but hang on, that doesn't add up. I mean, you were trashed by Brussels and by Frankfurt and by Berlin, and you come here to tell us that we should stay in that European Union? The answer was, absolutely. Because, you know, what has the left always done? We were critical of our states. We were exceptionally analytical in the way that we tore apart the whole construction of power, but our argument was not, unless of course we were Spanish anarcho-syndicalists, that we should bring it down. The argument was not even that we should reform it. The argument was that we should confront it in order to overcome and transcend. But to go back to Brexit just for a moment. Brexit won. We now have a comedy of errors on both sides, both within the European Union establishment and in London. This was inevitable. I believe that the DiEM25 position, which from the beginning was in favor of a long transition period along the lines of the Norway model, should that line is now seemingly, I hope it's true, gaining ground, even within the Conservative Party in Britain. Certainly, Jeremy Corbyn has adopted it. But the point I want to make is that it is a mistake to think of this long transition period, 5, 8, 10-year transition period, as a period during which the relationship between an intransient United Kingdom and European Union is simply hammered out. This must be a period during which the European Union transforms itself, because the European Union, unless it transforms itself and democratizes itself, unless there is a challenge to the cartel that is running the show, will simply cease to exist. And I'm very much afraid, and this is my message to my left-wing comrades who look forward to the disintegration of the EU as a neoliberal project, is beware that which you are wishing for, because it will not be us that will be in control of the nation states that will emerge from a fragmented and destroyed European Union. It will be the Nationalist International that are going to do their utmost to bring us back into a dystopia that we really do not want our children to live in. And finally, somebody asked the question, should we open our borders? Absolutely. Borders cannot be defended at any level. And let me be practical. I know that this doesn't sound very practical, because usually the considered opinion amongst the elites is that, well, we can't let all these millions of people come in. Well, folks, over the last 1,000 years, Europe has been exporting people to all four corners of the earth. We have colonized, we have destroyed, we've taken up and taken over. Well, guess what? The demography has changed. And this process has been reversed, and there is no border, no electrified fence that's going to end this. All we're doing is killing a lot of people and creating a lot of bad blood against Europeans. Well, why not embrace this demographic change and find ways of making the mass migration into Europe, which we need because we're getting old and decrepit, work for everyone.
thank you very much. Some questions were bundled and got a broader answer. So now we can take one second round. Who else likes to ask a question? Who was forgotten before? Above.
No, here. Here.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Good evening. I'm from Portugal, and as you may know, in Portugal we have now a progressist government since the end of 2015, and this government is a quite interesting solution because the government is ruled by the Socialist Party, but is supported by two radical left-wing parties. And this solution, which is popularly called contraption, is in fact working. The economy, they have this recovery program, and the economy is working quite well. So I have two questions. One, what is the main differences with the Greek case? And the other one, do you think that this solution can be seen as a kind of concrete alternative to the progressist force and to the social democratic parties in Europe?
Okay, now we have here 3 more questions in this corner here, all 3 together.
Nick Pensiero from UCL London. Thank you, Professor Varoufakis, for your very interesting talk and for your kind words towards sociologists of the past and current sociologists as well. The question, I have 2 questions. The first one relates to the role of the new currency that you are envisioning in your movement and your new idea of Europe. You mentioned fixed exchange rate and gold standard, but these two tools actually limit very much the possibility of deficit spending and spending of the governments, which we tremendously need in order to overcome this austerity. And the second question relates to your experience with negotiating with the devil. Given in light of this experience of negotiating with the devil, whereby the devil was bigger, was stronger, and basically crushed you and basically denied any kind of request, would you recommend other countries, other types of strategies of negotiating and maybe threatening to leave the monetary union? Thank you.
I don't see where the micro is, but it should go to this corner here, over there. We can take only 3 more questions because the end is reaching.
So I just like to say, if Thatcher thought that sociologists posed a threat to her ideological project, then I have to say that she was incredibly naive. Sociologists are very good at describing those who are antagonistic to capital, but not being antagonistic to capital themselves. So my question is for all of you, how do we make sociology dangerous?
Well, I have also a similar question, maybe. We don't know each other. We sit just next to each other here. Well, I noticed that we discovered the kind of enemy, neoliberalism. A word, by the way, I can't use in my institute. It's a sociology institute where I'm working. And I'm wondering, we are talking about the state structure, neoliberalism, and we know as sociologists that state structure has connections with social structure and personality structures. And then I'm wondering, how could we fight an enemy if we are part of this society, this state structure, and we have this enemy inside ourselves as sociologists or as normal citizens? How could we overcome this, this part of our own identity, our own existence?
Very close, this in white, behind you.
Thank you for the recognition. As I can read the title, I see Unmaking or Making Europe, and first of all, capitalism. So, excuse me. I have to make a question, and I will address to Mr. Varoufakis. Taking into consideration that United Nations, ECOS and ECOFIN councils have mostly the role of advisor, do you believe that Basel III, in a depth of years, will help Euro and Europe in general to rebuild the appropriate fiscal tools and economic system as a whole in order to prevent crises and bank collaterals like 2008? And what may be the potent maladjustments for a government to implement these radical changes, as we all before talked about radical changes and radical change in Europe? Thank you for the recognition again.
Okay, I see at the end we are reaching more critical questions. I think the last one, we have to take the last one now, because if not, we cannot get answers by them. And I was advised that there's one waiting since very, very long on the second floor there.
Konstantin Winovsky, I'm in the context of this radical changes that we're talking about. But do you see any alternative to capitalism?
Good questions. I think they need some minutes to be answered. She thinks now you could start.
Right, I'll take them in order. Firstly, what's the difference between Portugal and Greece? Well, Greece fell into the trap of insolvency well before Portugal. So Portugal has a third mover advantage. It was first Greece, then Ireland, then Portugal. That was important for Portugal because the Troika came to Greece and tried out their magic potions, and they were catastrophic. So when by the time they got to Lisbon, the degree of austerity that was applied in Lisbon was about 28% of the degree of austerity applied in this country. So if you're going to give poison to somebody, you might as well give less. Therefore, Portugal was in a lesser state of disaster than Greece was. That's point number one. Point number two, the left-wing government in Portugal, you've got to make a note of this, a mental note of this, was only formed after the political parties that joined to form it signed their own memorandum of understanding with the president of Portugal on behalf of the Eurogroup. So effectively, they accepted that they would not challenge the decisions of the Eurogroup before they were allowed to form a government. And what they did manage to do, given that the crisis in Portugal was always less in intensity and in terms of its dynamic than in Greece, what they managed to do, they didn't succeed at all in reversing any of the toxic policies that were imposed on Lisbon before, but they managed to ensure that no new toxic policies would be imposed. And the reason for that was because Portugal was included in the quantitative easing program of Mario Draghi in March 2015. And in effect, it was given a new bailout, but this time not through the bailout fund, but through the money printing machinery in Frankfurt. And therefore, you know, if you look at the yields of the bonds of Portugal, you realize that effectively the European Central Bank is subsidizing the repayments of Portuguese debt. Portugal never had the same degree of public debt that Greece has. The tragedy of Portugal is the exuberant amount of private debt. It is still sinking in a great deal of private debt. Households, firms are suffering massively from unpayable debt. Now, you may say that Portugal has recovered. I do not see this. Portugal has managed a small rebound as a result of the capacity of the new left-wing government to refuse new austerity. But I do not believe that Portugal is sustainable in the euro the way it is. And if you look at the debt dynamics, especially the private debt dynamics, you'll find that Portugal is today on a path that is leading to an intensification in the next few years, especially after quantitative easing by the European Central Bank eases, on a path towards a renewed deflationary bout. So I hope I'm proven by history spectacularly wrong, but I'm very much fear that the view that Portugal is out of the woods is wrong. Now, on the question of somebody mentioned that I proposed a new currency. I did not propose a new currency. I proposed a new capacity of member states, of governments, to produce their own liquidity using what I call fiscal money, but I won't give you a lecture on this. This is somebody must have read my recent articles. Thank you for doing this. It's not a new currency. It's an attempt to react to the fact that the illusion that monetary policy is something that the central bank should be concentrating on and the government should concentrate on fiscal matters. This illusory distinction is inimical to any chances of serious recovery and any chances of stabilization of our social economies. Well, somebody asked, have sociologists made sociology dangerous again? This is for you to answer. As an outsider, allow me to say that I don't think you've done well, but you've done a damn sight better than we economists have done, because economics has become the handmaiden of the most toxic policies in the history of the last 300 years. The takeover by splendid, aesthetically pleasing mathematical models of economics departments has been accomplished in conjunction with the complete removal of any sense of capitalism from within economics departments. So when you have economic policy designed by models which assume capitalism away, you end up with economic policies that fuel the capitalist crisis, no end. On the question of neoliberalism, look, of course, neoliberalism is a topic that you don't need me to lecture you on, but let me just very, very briefly say that one of the great signs of how deep the crisis in Europe is that it took the finance minister of a radical left-wing government to demand neoliberal solutions for Greece. And I was being denied them by the IMF. For instance, I was asking for a reduction in corporate taxes, corporate tax rates in Greece. Why? Because we are in a situation where I think almost every single corporation in Greece is either insolvent or has already closed down. We are in a state of a great, great depression, and pushing up corporate tax rates simply pushes them all above, beyond the border with Bulgaria. We already had, in the last 2 years, 40,000 firms moving up to Bulgaria, where the tax rate is 10%, when in this country, the neoliberal, supposedly Troika, imposed a tax rate of 29%, which doesn't sound really very large, except when you add the very interesting piece of information that corporations and even single-person companies have to prepay 100% of what the tax office estimates the corporate tax will be next year. This is what you do when you want to crash not just a society, but even a capitalist economy. So I wish we had neoliberalism so that I could fight against it on the streets. We don't even have neoliberalism. We have punitive illiberalism that is the result of that monstrous cross between an establishment that refuses to fail with its own, to deal with its own failures, and therefore turns to increasing authoritarianism by which to impose policies that Marxists and neoliberals would oppose at the same time. Just think about that for a second. Regarding Basel III, it's a joke. Basel III regulations are going to do nothing to stabilize financial capital. All they do is they enrich the accountants who are very, very good at making the capital ratios look rather smart. And finally, you asked me about envisaging alternatives to capitalism. Well, the good news is that even though we leftists have failed to overthrow capitalism, capitalism is doing an excellent job at overthrowing itself, as Karl Marx had predicted. The technological innovations that are happening as we speak are going to make the capitalism that we know absolutely unsustainable. The great question is not whether we can envisage alternatives to capital, but whether we can impose the democratic politics that will bring about an alternative to capitalism that will not resemble The Matrix, the movie.
Thank you.
I'm left with the easy questions about how to make sociology dangerous. And I have to confess again that I'm not sure I know the answer, but I think that there are some things which we shouldn't do and some things that we should try instead to do. One is the one Yanis mentioned. Take the examples of other disciplines in which the type of development brought about a lack of capacity to deal with the social problems. And I think that there are two types of things, two types of developments that we should reflect upon. One is, for a long time in our disciplines, the idea was imitate economics and try to become very professionalized, which meant having research design focusing on method-driven or theory-driven type of approaches, forgetting about the problems. And I think that instead one of the issues which is important is to focus again on issues which are important as social problems. But there is also another element. I don't think we can think only about the sociologists. So what we have in front of us are problems which are so big that specializations also of the various disciplines is something we have to resist. So in my own thinking and development, it has been very often important to go beyond sociology, to learn from political philosophers, to learn from political economists, and so on. And I think that this is a point that has been made by Wolfgang Streeck, for instance, about the need, if we want to understand capitalism, to go beyond disciplinary boundaries. And another element which I think is important, and it is important to take the lessons from other countries and other disciplines which failed to address these challenges, is the risk of becoming paradigmatic type of disciplines in the sense of focusing only on some methodological truth. And while I think that in European sociology in particular, there are a lot of resources to contrast these risks, because there is still importance of national type of traditions which bring about diversities in the disciplines, because there is still an opening, especially in some fields. For instance, I can talk about my own fields in social movement studies, for going beyond methodological wars and try to understand what the different type of methods can contribute to our knowledge. So I think that in these issues, problem-oriented, interdisciplinary and methodologically plural, there is not the answer to the questions, but at least part of the answer. Alternative to capitalism is another difficult question. I want here also to cite Wolfgang Streeck, who in a recent book said, could be that there is an end of capitalism and we don't know yet what will develop. Well, what Streeck was reasoning about was the failure of a first attempt to save capitalism through welfare, the failure of the second attempt to save capitalism through neoliberalism, which instead of producing effective type of capitalist forms, produced enormous crises, produced corruptions, produced big corporations that are too big to fail, but also too big to jail, is what Colin Crouch, I think, said. And so I think that here we can imagine that there is some alternative, even if we don't know yet which one it is. But I also tend to believe that in a sort of Polanyi type of movements and counter-movements, probably what we are going to see in the next times is struggle in order to mitigate capitalism, introduce social justice, and think about alternative, which we do not know yet. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one sentence by both of you. I think in addition to your very sharp analysis, you will understand that at the end of the day, when we listen to so many sessions, we are tired, we are also human beings. And yesterday we had the question of capitalism, very critical debate. At lunchtime we talked about Europe entrapped. It would be very nice for us to have a common and positive end. Yeah, I think you will understand this. And as we know from the theater play of Bertolt Brecht, who outlined there must be the end must be good, must. We need a good end. We like to go for dinner and to sleep well. The question is, making Europe, unmaking Europe. I hope you say you foresee the making of Europe, because we would need this, we would like this. So my question is, what do you foresee? Do you foresee the next crisis, or do you foresee the making of the social Europe? I know we are empirical scientists, so we can never know. The reality is complex. You must do empirical research. In economics, you have model, possibly you can foresee. And just at the end of the day, what do you foresee? Unmaking Europe or making Europe?
I make it a point not to predict what and when. I had a statistics professor once that taught me that give them a number, prediction, or give them a fact, but don't predict what will happen, when it will happen, because then you'll end up with egg on your face. But allow me to make the political point, however, that there is no evidence at all supporting an optimistic view about Europe. But that does not matter. This is not like predicting the weather. We, in the social sciences, are dealing with a beast which is part and parcel of our own beliefs about the beast, and we and our beliefs are part and parcel of that beast. Therefore, we do not have the luxury of a meteorologist or an astronomer who can sit here, and make predictions, knowing, safe in the thought that they do not influence the outcome. That whatever predictions you make, nature will do whatever nature will do. In sociology, in economics, in anthropology, our attempt to understand, especially when we communicate, it becomes part of the explanandum. And that gives us a moral responsibility, not to be optimistic, but to remain hopeful and constantly vigilant and move out of academia at some point, or stay with one foot in academia and be a political activist with the other, to change the world, not just to interpret it.
I tend to agree, and I mentioned Gramsci already, and Gramsci called us to be pessimistic in our analysis, but optimistic in the will. And I think that what I see from the empirical point of view, what other scholars are studying, is the fact that we live in situations which has a lot of negative sides. We saw the Brexit, we saw Trump winning elections, but at the same time also we saw strong resistance. We saw a resistance by young people that mobilized and emerged as very progressive in their views. So I think we are really in a moment in which there is a strong conflict. What I think is that Europe cannot survive as European Union institutions without changing, and social movements cannot win without addressing also the European Union institutions. So I don't predict anything in the short term, but if I have to talk about expectations, I expect that Europeanizations of social movements will continue, and so that there will be a continuous pressures towards improving Europe in the directions of a more social Europe and more democratic. But I think it can be a very long process.
Thank you very much. So Making, Unmaking Europe will go on. Also, our conference will also go on. Thank you for your presentations. Thank you very much for your patience and your very good questions. Enjoy the evening and have a good night.